No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. What if comparing car insurance rates was as easy as putting on your favorite podcast? With Progressive, it is. Just visit the Progressive website to quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's direct rate, then their tool will provide options from other companies so you can compare. All you need to do is choose the rate and coverage you like. Quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
The truest expression of our character is what we do habitually.
That's Charles Duhigg, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of the celebrated book, The Power of Habit.
The principles behind how a habit forms within our neurology, it does not distinguish between good habits and bad habits. In fact, there is no such thing as good habits and bad habits. There's just habits. And then it's up to us to decide which of those are habits that we wish to embrace, because they either make us feel happier or less happy, or more fulfilled or less fulfilled, or more in control or less in control.
Today, if our habits form who we are, how can we learn to form our habits? Plus, Charles discusses his new book, Supercommunicators.
Some people are so much better at connecting with others than everyone else. Anyone can be a super communicator. It's just a matter of learning these skills.
All coming right up. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. We talk about habits a great deal on No Small Endeavor. They inform what we do, shape who we are, and what is both terrifying on the one hand and helpful on the other hand is that our habits allow us to do much of what we do in and with our lives on automatic. That is to say, habitually. But how do we form habits? Or how do we change habits we find destructive? Charles Duhigg is the author of The Power of Habit, a book which I read years ago and had forgotten how helpful it was to me until I reread it for my conversation today. We'll do a deep dive into how to form a new habit and how to change habits that you do not want. And if that's not enough, Charles has a new book out called Supercommunicators, which you might find helpful in transforming the ways you converse with the people around you. Today, our conversation with Charles Duhigg. Charles Duhigg is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of The Power of Habit, which we'll be discussing today. Spent over 3 years on bestseller lists, and it's been translated into 40 languages. Most recently, he's the author of another bestseller, Supercommunicators, published in 2024, as well as Smarter, Faster, Better, yet a third bestseller. Mr. Duhigg writes for the New Yorker magazine and is a graduate of Yale University and the Harvard Business School. He's been a frequent contributor to CNBC, This American Life, NPR, PBS's NewsHour, and Frontline. Welcome, Charles Duhigg.
Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you with us. Your book, The Power of Habit, I read it years ago. I'm a professor for my day job, and I reread it in preparation for our conversation today. And I kept kind of page after page, I thought, oh, wait, that's where I got that story from. And that's where I got that story from. And as well, I'll say, I started years ago telling my students, I teach ethics classes, and I tell my students that, if I could control one thing about your life that would control the outcomes of your life, it would be your habits. And I think that's probably another thing that I probably picked up from you as well. It also comes from Aristotle, as you rightfully note in your book. And so I think that might be a really interesting place for us to start, because we talk a lot on No Small Endeavor about human flourishing, notions of human flourishing, and virtues as those habits and skills and dispositions which engender human flourishing. And Aristotle, you rightfully note, says it's all rooted in habits. We are what we repeatedly do, he said. Excellence is not an act, but a habit. And so I think with that, the first question I would like to ask is, would you make the case that our habits and attention to our habits is central to a flourishing life?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's central to an ethical life, to a flourishing life, to a life where we feel like we're in control. I mean, it's interesting. So I have a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old. And do you have kids?
3 boys, yes.
Okay, so I have 2 boys. And so you probably have experienced this yourself, that so much of parenting is trying to teach kids the right habits, but also how to understand their own habits so that they have control over their choices. And we always say to them, like, you have to listen to that little voice inside your head that tells you whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, whether you should listen to your friends. And of course, that little voice inside our head is habit, right? It's the habit that we grow accustomed to. It's the habit that we practice until it becomes part of who we are. That is the truest expression of our character, is what we do habitually.
Yep. And it's also worth noting, of course, that destructive habits are perhaps the thing that set us up for the most grave difficulties in our lives.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that there's a part of our brain, the basal ganglia, that exists just to make habits, right? And this is because our brains are cognitive misers. They would like to avoid having to use energy if at all possible, because that from an evolutionary perspective frees up brain processing power to think about new things and be creative and invent fire or aircraft carriers. Our brain will make anything it can into a habit. And what's really important is that the principles behind how a habit forms within our neurology, it does not distinguish between good habits and bad habits. In fact, there is no such thing as good habits and bad habits. There's just habits. And then it's up to us to decide which of those are habits that we wish to embrace and which of those are habits that we wish to change, because they either make us feel happier or less happy, or more fulfilled or less fulfilled, or more in control or less in control.
Typically in theology or biblical studies, you have this word sin, which is typically translated from the Greek word hamartia. But it's interesting to me that kind of in Greco-Roman literature, hamartia doesn't carry necessarily this sort of religious notion or moralistic notion, but it's this notion that this is a habit or a character trait or a tendency that if you get destroyed or you self-destruct, this is the thing that's going to do you in.
Oh, that's interesting.
I find that a very helpful way to think about that. We've got these habits that, and even the word excellence in Aristotle, that's the word arete that can also be translated virtue. And so we've got this notion that these habitually things we do, they can lead us in a multiplicity of paths to flourishing or to destruction, that I find a helpful way to think about these habits.
I think that's right. Whenever I've made mistakes or talked to other people who've made mistakes, you usually, when you're making the mistake, it doesn't feel like a big decision, right? It feels like a decision you've made 1,000 times before. And the truth of the matter is you have made it 1,000 times before. You're reacting habitually. It's just that this time you've reached the end of the rope. And this is the time that you see the consequences of it.
Yeah. So the good news of your book is that you're insisting that habits can be changed if we understand how they work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any habit can be changed. And 40 to 45% of what we do every day is a habit, according to studies that have been done by a number of researchers. When you back your car to the driveway, you're doing it by habit. When you walk into the cafeteria and you really intended to get a salad, but you end up getting that unhealthy sandwich you get every day, that's a habit. 40 to 45% of what we do every day happens almost non-consciously. But every single part of that is under our control if we choose it to be.
Now, I can imagine someone listening and saying, well, look, whatever. I've tried repeatedly in my life to change a given habit, and I have not had any luck. So what kind of response or hope might you give someone like that?
So I think the first thing to understand is that's totally natural, right? And oftentimes when we fail, it's because we don't understand how habits work. And there's a core insight into how habits function, which is every habit has three components. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for an automatic behavior. And then there's the routine, the behavior itself, what we think of as the habit. And then finally, there's a reward. Every habit in your life delivers a reward to you, whether you're aware of it or not. And what's important to recognize is that we oftentimes think about changing a habit or trying to fix a habit or create a habit by focusing exclusively on the behavior, on the routine. But what we've learned from experiments is that it's the cue and the reward where our greatest leverage power exists. That if we focus on the cue and reward and start fiddling with the gears, we can change the behavior much more easily.
Keep unpacking that for us a little bit. What might it look like for us then to take seriously paying attention to the cue and the reward in a practical way of thinking about changing habits?
So let's talk about building a habit, right? Because building a habit and changing a habit are a little bit different. But let's say what's a habit that you would like to start?
Well, I actually am starting one, like right today, reading your book. I thought, okay, I'm going to try this. And so what I'm actually started doing today is give myself a much more clear routine for the early afternoon, because I have very strict rules for myself in the mornings. And typically my early afternoon is much less structured and thus less focused. And I believe that's important to have times that are less structured, but I think I'm not satisfied with where I am. So today I started working on a new routine for my early afternoon.
Okay, let's take it through the process. Okay, so the first thing is you got to figure out a cue, right? And cues fall into one of 5 buckets most of the time. It's usually a time of day or a particular place or the presence of certain other people or a particular emotion that you're feeling or a preceding behavior that's become ritualized.
Okay.
And what's great when we're creating a habit, when we're building a habit, is to try and get as many of those as we can and then figure out which one is really impactful for us. So let's talk about time of day. So when do you want this to start? Like, when is this habit going to start?
Yeah, so I was thinking that I would use eating lunch as my cue.
Okay. So eating lunch, and do you usually eat lunch at roughly the same time every day?
Roughly in the noon hour, yeah.
Okay, so between noon and 1, let's say.
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't have to be like 12:15. But we're basically talking about a time of day. Okay, so that's time of day. And where do you usually eat lunch?
That varies from day to day. So it can be at home, it can be at school, or it can be out and about around Nashville.
That's totally fine. So that's not a cue that's available to us, but that's okay. It's good to recognize that. Okay, so it's time of day. Do you usually eat lunch with the same people, or is it different from day to day?
It's different from day to day.
Fantastic. So that's not a cue that's available to us. How do you feel when you eat lunch most days?
I usually feel at peace and like it's a nice breather, because as I said, I usually start fairly early in the day. So by the time I get to lunch, I've worked pretty good, and it's nice to be still, eat.
Yeah.
If I'm visiting with people, visit with people. But yeah, I typically feel kind of good about it at lunchtime.
So, okay, so we've got 2 cues so far, time of day and a particular emotion that you usually feel kind of calm and reflective. And then finally, is there a preceding behavior leading up to lunch that's kind of ritualized? Like, do you tend to do the same thing every day before you head off for lunch?
Yeah, I'm a practitioner of Cal Newport's deep work stuff. And so I do typically 60 minutes of deep work right before lunch.
Perfect. So we've got 3 cues that we can leverage. Now what we need to do is we need to figure out a reward. And the lunch is the cue, right? We're not building a habit to eat lunch. You already eat lunch just fine. It's that lunch is this little package of cues. And afterwards, you want to have a habit to do what? Like, you've finished eating your lunch, you've felt calm, you've done your 60 minutes of deep work. What is the behavior, the routine that you want to create?
So I'm a big nap practitioner as well. And so I want to nap, but I want to nap for 18 minutes. And then when I get up from my nap, I want to drink a glass of water, get a cup of tea, and then I want to have some sort of structured time of work. That's not deep work, but it's just things I need to do. And it can vary. So that bucket could be conducting an interview right now during this time frame. It could be teaching a class. It could be working on something for the household, but some sort of thing that's constructive. And then I immediately want to go to the gym and work out. And then that's my early afternoon through about 3:30 or 4.
So there's a lot of behaviors there, but let's go ahead. So you want to eat lunch, then you'll take an 18-minute nap, then you'll wake up, you'll drink a glass of water, you'll do 30 to 45 minutes of work, an hour of work, and then you'll go to the gym.
An hour, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So there's a couple of preconditions, right? Like, you got to have a timer that will wake you up after 18 minutes. You need to know what you're going to do with that hour of work. You probably should have a to-do list or a goal just so that you know what task to do. That's our behavior. We're going to set that aside for a moment. Now, the question is, and usually what we would do is we would look at each of those behaviors as its own habit.
Okay.
But for sake of this argument, for this conversation, let's say you get through all of that, right? You do it perfectly. Nap, water, work, workout. What reward are you going to give yourself?
I would like to give myself a beer at a place that's just around the corner from the Y.
Perfect. And what I was worried you were going to say is like, well, after working out, I should probably eat some kale chips. Because the problem with kale chips is that is not a reward, right? Yeah. We have to give ourselves rewards that are actually rewarding. And a beer is perfect because a beer
good.
is beer is something that you can't do when you're working, and you could probably do it before you nap, but it wouldn't work out well. You can't do it when you're working out. Okay, so we've identified a cue, a routine, and a reward. Now you just need to commit to it. And the first couple of times you do this, it might not feel easy, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to train our brain to associate this cue, this routine, and this reward by doing it once or twice, maybe even 3 times. And the first time you do it, you might find that it's hard to fall asleep. The second time you do it, you might find you just work for 45 minutes, then you're exhausted. The third time you do it, you might be on your way to the gym and you're like, I'm not going to do a full workout. I'm just feeling kind of tired. But what's going to happen is that at some point, your basal ganglia is going to associate those 3 things. You're going to start looking forward to that beer. When you go and you eat lunch, all of a sudden you're going to be thinking about that beer, and the interim steps are going to happen easier and easier and easier until it feels almost automatic. It doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like something that just happens automatically. That's how you build a habit in your life. Now, changing a habit is a little bit different, though.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Okay, so what's a habit that you'd like to change?
Let's see. Probably procrastinating with regard to grading papers, which is the bane of my existence.
Absolutely. My wife is an academic. She's grading right now. She hates it. It's the worst, right? I'm always like, just give them all A's. She's like, no, that's not my job. It's not responsible. But yes, grading is rough. Okay, so, and you want to stop procrastinating. At those moments when you should be grading and you are procrastinating instead, what's the cue? What's going on that makes you, what do you do to procrastinate instead of grade?
Stupid stuff like mess around with email or go to Instagram or
Instagram.
Social media. Yeah.
What's the cue for when you go to Instagram or social media instead of grading what you know you should be doing?
Boredom.
Okay.
Boredom and I do not want the pain of that.
Boredom and the anxiety that comes from anticipating the boredom you're going to feel grading these exams.
Yeah.
It's good. It's good that we've identified that cue. We know what it is. Now, here's my next question. What is the reward that Instagram is providing for you?
Distraction and I guess the little dopamine release that we get when we scroll.
Okay, so let's push a little bit in on this because distraction, I could also distract you by like hitting you with a stick, right? You could distract yourself by going out and taking a walk or by throwing pennies at a wall. There's lots of ways you could distract yourself. So distraction on its own is probably not a full explanation of the reward. Now, you mentioned this dopamine hit you get from scrolling, but tell me how that feels. Like, what is it that Instagram serves up for you that actually feels compelling or interesting or that you crave?
Well, I fly gliders, sailplanes, and so I follow some pilot stuff, and I like being intrigued with that kind of stuff. I like travel, and so I follow some travel stuff on Instagram, and so there's this sort of escape into something that feels more enjoyable than the notion of grading.
What I hear you saying is that you like to learn. You like to learn about things that you're interested in. You like the novelty of seeing new things about what you're interested in. Am I getting that right?
I think so. I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So here's what we want to do. We want to create a new habit where the cue is this boredom and sort of anxiety you feel about grading. And the reward is something that feels a little bit novel, that feels a little bit like you're learning about something you're interested in, that feels like a chance to indulge an interest that you have. And we want to try and figure out how we connect that to grading papers. And there's 2 ways we could do that. Number one is we could say, okay, look, we know that Instagram is providing this reward for you. And my guess is it only provides the reward intermittently. That sometimes you go on Instagram and you see stuff that's interesting, and sometimes you go on Instagram and it's kind of boring. What if we were to say, when you're feeling that anxiety, that boredom, your hesitancy to grade the papers, set the alarm for 15 minutes, grade for 15 minutes, and when you're done, don't go to Instagram because Instagram is not a reliable delivery source of the reward you're looking for. Go to the website about gliding or go start a gliding documentary, right? And just watch it. Watch it for 10 or 15 minutes. And then you go back to the grading for another 15 minutes. And then you give yourself 15 minutes of watching the glider documentary and back and forth and back and forth. So now what you're doing is you're taking grading and you're associating it with this reward that you actually enjoy.
Huh.
But there's another route here, which is to say, okay, the cue is boredom, it's this anxiety. Is there a way to make grading papers more interesting, more novel, and more rewarding for you? My guess is you're interested in the stuff that you're grading, right? That's why you teach it. It's not that you're teaching stuff that totally bores you. What's boring is like seeing students just kind of like fill in bubbles on a Scantron or trying to grapple with ideas that you already know. But is there a way to inject some novelty, some interest into what they are writing? Instead of giving them multiple choice tests, if they're writing essays, are the essays more interesting for you to read than grading the multiple choice test? If they're writing essays and the essays are totally boring, is there a way to make those essays more likely to deliver interesting answers? Which means maybe instead of asking the obvious question, maybe you're asking them a question where they have to process an idea, and the answers that they're going to provide are going to be more compelling and more interesting for you to read. Is there a way to change this behavior so it delivers something similar to that old reward that you used to get?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Both of those as options on the routine are compelling possibilities. I'll try them. I'll try both.
Try them out. And here's the thing about habit design. Just because we can identify the cue, the routine, the reward, just because we have a plan, that's not the last step. That's the first step. Because oftentimes what we find is we don't really understand what our cues and our rewards are until we start conducting experiments with them. And so you might find that actually it doesn't matter what question you ask. It's just boring. Your students aren't bright enough to write interesting stuff. And that's just something you got to deal with. And so you should set aside 15 minutes of grading and then 15 minutes of watching this documentary, because that's the best way to reward yourself. But you might also find that actually if you ask the right question in the right way, these students, they say the stuff that's so interesting. It's so much fun to actually read what they're saying. You don't mind grading anymore because it is novel. It is new. You're not just asking them to regurgitate an idea to see if they've learned it. You're asking them to play with an idea and say something new you haven't thought of. When we conduct the experiments, that's when we learn what rewards are actually driving our behaviors. And what's important to recognize is we almost have to be scientists about ourselves and our own lives. My wife is a scientist. As I mentioned, she's an academic. If a scientist does experiments and the experiments work every single time, that is a terrible scientist. That is not the goal of being a scientist. A scientist should do experiments, and some of them fail and some of them succeed and they learn something. And if you experiment with a new habit in your life and it doesn't work right away, that doesn't mean that you're a failure. That means that you're a scientist who has learned something useful and interesting, and now you can apply that to the next iteration of this experiment.
Yeah, very helpful. Very helpful. You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Charles Duhigg. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We would be delighted if you'd tell your friends about No Small Endeavor and invite them to join us on the podcast, because it helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, Charles and I discuss Keystone habits that have a chain reaction, you might say, in our lives to help us flourish in all manner of ways. So let's talk about this notion of keystone habits and unpack that for us and tell us how we might go about identifying some of those.
So there's some habits that when you change, they set off this chain reaction, right? They change other patterns in your life as well. For instance, for many people, when they start exercising, on the days that they exercise, it's easier for them to eat healthy that day. And that seems to make sense to us for some reason. We think that like my legs are sore as I walk into the cafeteria, and for some reason that makes it easier to grab the salad rather than the sandwich. What's interesting is that two researchers, Odin and Chang, also found that on the days that you exercise, you tend to use your credit cards less. You tend to procrastinate about 20% less at work. If you're someone who like washes your dishes or does other household chores, the types of things that it's easy to procrastinate about, you tend to do them about 18 minutes earlier in the day on the days that you exercise. Now, none of us are going for a run in the morning and we're thinking to ourselves, oh, I'm going to keep my Amex in my pocket today. But there's something about exercise that for some people sets off this chain reaction that changes other patterns in our life. In The Power of Habit, there's a bunch of stories of this, right? We tell the story of Paul O'Neill at Alcoa, which is a large aluminum company, and that when Paul O'Neill decided to focus on worker safety, that it changed a number of other habits inside the factories. People started getting safer, but they also started producing better aluminum. They started working more efficiently. The disputes between labor and management started diminishing because for Alcoa, worker safety was a keystone habit that set off changes in other patterns as well. And this is one of the things that we know is that identifying a keystone habit is really, really important. And the reason why it works is because it changes our sense of self. There is a part of your brain that ignores everything you say to yourself and just looks at how you behave to figure out who you really are. And that part of your brain, if you say like, I love exercise, I love to be healthy, that part of your brain is saying like, you say that, but I see you eating junk food. I see you not getting up early to go exercise. I don't buy it. When we start an exercise habit, what we're doing is we're telling that part of our brain, no, you got it wrong. I see myself a little bit differently. We change our innermost self-image. And that's why it sets off a chain reaction that changes these other patterns. That's why it creates a sense of flexibility and openness in our life that we can take advantage of. A lot of this has to do with what's known as revealed versus stated preferences. Very often, if you ask people what they like and what they dislike, they will answer one way, and then if you provide them with temptations and opportunities, they will behave a different way. And for a long time, we basically thought, oh, these are people who are lying to themselves, right? They know the truth, but their aspirations are greater than their instincts. But that's actually not what's happening at all. What's happening is that they believe those aspirations. They believe those stated preferences. They believe that they want to lose weight. They believe that they want to eat more healthily. But their revealed preferences are different. And that's because there's a part of our brain that pays attention to our revealed preferences and a part of our brain that pays attention to our stated preferences. And in order to change our behavior, in order to know who we really are, we have to train ourselves to look for both of those. So if I say I'm someone who wants to exercise, I believe in exercise, I think exercise is healthy, but I'm not actually exercising, that does not mean I'm a hypocrite. That means that I am someone who doesn't recognize the difference between my stated and my revealed preferences. And once I do recognize it, it gives me the ability to start making changes that might encourage me to live more in alignment with my stated preferences. We've all felt this, right? And what's really happening is that in our brain, our revealed preferences most often come out of the deep interior structures that are evolutionarily older, right? Those parts of our brains that feel rather than think, and those parts of our brains that we're often less in sort of intellectual touch with. So when I say, I think exercise is important, I think we should all exercise, I'm using my prefrontal cortex, and I'm very much in touch with my prefrontal cortex. When I see an opportunity to exercise and I'm like, I'm going to watch TV and eat ice cream instead, my prefrontal cortex is usually not quite as involved in that decision. It's coming from my amygdala, my basal ganglia, the deeper interior structures, and I'm less aware of them because they're just less conscious.
Yeah. So on Keystone Habits, then, I think some of the ones that you point to in the book, making one's bed as a simple sort of exercise that might have ripple effects.
Yeah.
Food journaling is a simple habit that could have ripple effects. Other sorts of practical Keystone habits that you've seen be successful for folks?
I mean, anything can be a Keystone habit. And the way to figure out what a Keystone habit is for you, because it's different from person to person, is to look at the kind of changes that you wish you could make and that seem kind of irrationally scary or hard to you. If you were an athlete when you were young, the idea of starting an exercise routine again, it doesn't seem very scary. And so it's unlikely that that will become a keystone habit for you. But if you're someone like me who is never an athlete, and you think about, I should go running tomorrow, all of a sudden there's all these irrational fears like, yeah, but like, what am I going to wear? And like, I don't know what route to take, and I'm going to look really stupid. You know, what if I get out there and I only run like 2 blocks and then I'm like winded already? All those anxieties is a clue that this can be a keystone habit for you. Because when you wake up and you go running, even though there's all these things that it's easy to say to dissuade you from doing it, when you do it, you're proving something to yourself about who you are. That's why making your bed, look, if you grew up in the military, if you grew up making your bed every day, making your bed is just part of who you are. It's a great habit. It's an important habit, but it's probably not a keystone habit. But if you're someone who grew up and you always felt like you were kind of disorganized and you wish that you procrastinated less, then when you wake up and you make your bed, what you're saying to yourself is, I am the kind of person who wakes up and makes their bed. I'm the kind of person who ignores distractions, who ignores the potential for mess. And so any habit can become a keystone habit if we endow it with the ability to change how we see ourselves.
Yeah, that's helpful. You have some conversation around willpower and self-control, and you're pointing to the research that's been done over the last several decades. It's teaching us that willpower is best understood with the analogy of a metaphor of a muscle, that it's something that we have a kind of limited amount each day, and the more we pay attention to that fact, then the better we can employ it and use it. And then obviously with habits, and especially trying to break or change destructive habits, a lot of times the notion of willpower almost seems counterproductive, because repeatedly we'll hear, and I know some of my own experience in years past, when if I had some sort of destructive habit, I'll say, I'll never do that again. And then I do it again. And then I'm just frustrated because I feel like I don't have any willpower. But what I hear you saying is that approach may be failing to use willpower where it might actually be very effective, namely in discerning our habits and learning how to change them.
That's exactly right. So willpower is an act of exertion. And the thing that characterizes a habit is that it happens almost automatically without exertion. So in some respects, willpower and habits are the opposites of each other. Now, we try and use willpower to shape our habits, right? We say, I've been smoking for 13 years. I'm going to use my willpower to give up cigarettes tomorrow. And we can do that. There can be successes to that. But what happens is when we focus on the willpower rather than the underlying habit, oftentimes our willpower does get tired and we give up cigarettes until our mother-in-law comes into town, or until we have a bad day, or until we get into a car accident. Then the first thing we do is we pick up that cigarette because that habit is still there. It's still lurking in our psyche. And so the thing to think about is exactly as you just put it, use your willpower to identify the habit that you want to change. Use it to start that process of change, right? Because the first day that you do give up cigarettes, no matter how many cues and routines you've thought of, it's going to be tough. You need to use that willpower. But use the willpower as something that allows you to inform the habit change rather than just the white knuckling of the willpower itself. Cigarettes is a great example, right? Many people, if you've smoked regularly, gave them up 10 years ago, many people still crave a cigarette 10 years later with their morning cup of coffee. That's not a physical addiction. You haven't smoked a cigarette in 10 years. There's no nicotine in your blood system. It's a habit dysfunction. It's a habit that you still carry around. And so rather than thinking about extinguishing a habit with your willpower, what we should think about is changing that habit, as we described before. That you start saying, okay, look, what's the cue for a cigarette? Oh, I always want it in the morning with my coffee. Okay, there's your cue. What reward is it delivering to me? Well, it's actually giving me this like boost of energy, right? Because nicotine gives us energy. Okay, so if we're not going to use nicotine to get that energy anymore, then we need to find something else to give us that little boost of energy. So maybe we start over-sugaring our coffee to get a little bit more energy in the morning to offset that craving. Or maybe it's not the energy that the cigarette gives me. Maybe it's that I smoke at 10 in the morning and it's just a nice way to take a break. Like it lets me go out, it lets me socialize with other smokers. Okay, so now at 10 o'clock when you usually have your cigarette, You need to go out and you need to socialize with other people. You need to give yourself a break. Maybe it means you don't do it on the smoking corner. Maybe it means you walk the opposite direction and you find someone and you gossip with them at their desk a little bit. But the point is to pay attention, use your willpower to identify the cues and rewards that are driving your behavior and to make that change, because that change is going to be hard at first. But the more that it's changing a habit, the easier and easier and easier it's going to become.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, why are some people so much better at connecting with others? Charles discusses this question and other insightful material from his newest book, Supercommunicators: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. Hey there! Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. In the little bit of time we have left, let's turn to Supercommunicators, if you wouldn't mind giving us an overview, which is about habits of communication, right?
That's right. That's right. It's about why some people are so much better at connecting with others than everyone else.
What have you discovered in that regard?
Well, this kind of started because I fell into this bad pattern with my wife. We've been married for 20 years, and I would come home from a long day at work, and I'd start complaining about work. And my wife very practically and reasonably would give me some good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear her good advice, I would get even more upset. And I would say, you're supposed to be supporting me. You're supposed to be on my side. Why aren't you outraged on my behalf? And she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. I think anyone who's listening who's in a relationship, this is a pattern that we're all familiar with, right? We
know this pattern, yes.
Yeah. Yes. And so I went to these experts and I was like, what's going on here? I'm a journalist. Like, why am I having such trouble communicating? And what they said was, well, the thing we figured out is that we tend to think of a discussion as being about one thing, right? We're talking about my day or where to go on vacation or some argument about life. And actually, every single discussion is made up of multiple different kinds of conversations. And in general, those conversations tend to fall into one of three buckets. These conversations about practical matters, where we're solving problems or we're making plans. But then there's emotional conversations, where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and the social identities that are important to us. And what they said is all three of those kind of big buckets, all three of those conversations are equally legitimate. But if you're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, then you won't really connect with each other. You won't be able to hear each other fully. And that's what was happening with me, right? I was coming home and I was having an emotional conversation. My wife was responding with a practical conversation. And so we weren't hearing each other. And this has given rise to what's known as the matching principle. And what the matching principle says is, what's important as a first step in communication is figuring out what kind of conversation is happening and then having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. Once you do that, once you and I are aligned, then we can move from emotional to practical to social back to emotional together. But without that alignment, we will not fully hear each other.
So what are some kind of practical things to look for in trying to discern what the person we're talking to, what level of conversation? So it's practical, emotional, or social, and we want to try to sort out which one of those that they're in.
There's actually a technique for doing this, which is you ask questions. And you ask a special kind of question known as a deep question. And a deep question is something that asks about values or beliefs or experiences. And that can sound a little bit intimidating, but it's as simple as, for instance, if you meet a doctor, instead of saying, where do you practice medicine, saying, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Or what do you love about practicing medicine? Right? When I ask that question, what I'm doing is I'm inviting you to tell me something about how you see the world. Tell me something about yourself. And inevitably, what you're going to do is you're going to tell me what kind of mindset you're in at this moment. Because the same person might answer that question in one setting by saying, oh, I wanted to find something that would be a steady job. I really wanted a good job. I knew that a doctor would always have work, right? That's why someone in a practical mindset right now. But that same person at a different party, in a different setting, they might say, oh, my dad got sick when I was a kid and I saw these doctors help him. I wanted to be one of those helpers. Like, it made me feel so impressed and so grateful. Okay, that person is in an emotional mindset, right? What they're telling me is what kind of conversation they want to have right now. And that doesn't mean that I have to have that conversation, but it means that if I match them or I invite them to match me, we're much more likely to become aligned.
Yeah, very helpful. So once one has tried to discern what sort of conversation we're in, what beyond that?
Well, so at that point, what's really important is that we have to prove that we're listening to each other, right? So this is particularly true in conflict conversations where we disagree with each other, where we're talking about something kind of sensitive like race or politics or religion or money. A conversation where maybe we actually just completely were in a fight, like we explicitly disagree with each other. In those conversations, there is often in the back of our head this small suspicion that the other person is not actually listening to me. They are just waiting their turn to speak. This happens all the time, right? And so the question is, how do we overcome this? How do we prove that we're listening? Well, most folks kind of assume the way that I do this is my behavior while you're speaking. I nod my head. I say, that's interesting. But the thing is that speaking is such a cognitively intense activity that we tend to forget or not notice what other people are doing when we're talking. So what's important is what you do after they finish speaking. For the most important conversations, there's this technique that they teach at Harvard and Stanford, a bunch of schools, known as looping for understanding. And this is what they do. They say, look, here's how you prove that you're listening. Step one is ask a question, preferably a deep question if you can. Go ahead and listen to what the person says. Step two is repeat back to them in your own words what you heard them say. And the key here is not mimicry. I'm not using the exact same words that you used. I'm trying to prove to you that I was paying attention. And more important, I'm trying to prove to you that I'm processing it. I'm actually making sense of what you have told me. And then step three, and this is the step we usually forget, is ask if you got it right. And the reason why that step is so powerful is because one of two things is going to happen. Either the person is going to say, no, I don't think you fully understood me. And that's useful, right? To know that like I only heard part of what you said. Or they might say, yeah, I think you heard what I was trying to say. And what we're actually doing in that moment is we're asking them for permission to acknowledge that we were listening. Because when you acknowledge that I was listening to you, you become more likely to listen to me. There's a basic social reciprocity that occurs. It's hardwired into our brains that when I think you're listening, I'm going to listen back. And that's how we prove that we're listening.
Yeah. So identify the kind of conversation, practical, emotional, or social, and then practice looping. That is, ask a deep question, repeat back what you hear them saying in your own words, and then ask them if that's right. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great example of looping. You did a really good job.
Yeah. So what other kind of practical things beyond that then have you learned?
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, and Supercommunicators goes into like these set of skills because communication is just skills, right? Anyone can be a supercommunicator. It's just a matter of learning these skills. But I think underlying all of them is something that's really important, which is the way that we connect with other people is as a first and most important step. We show them that we want to connect. And when that's our goal, when we keep that in our mind, it gives us a lot of opportunities. Take laughter, for instance. There's been a bunch of studies of laughter. And what they found is that 80% of the time when people laugh, it's not in response to anything funny, right? It's not that someone made a joke. Rather, in conversations when we laugh, it's usually to show the other person that we want to connect with them.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I love that.
And when they laugh back, what they're saying is, I want to connect with you too.
Right. Yeah.
And so part of it is being aware of the fact that the more I laugh in a conversation, the more I'm showing you that I want to connect with you. And so I ought to laugh. Or I ought to, if you bring up something hard that's happened to you, I ought to console you a little bit. I ought to lean in to the experience that you're having. And what I'm really saying there is, look, I want to show you that I want to connect with you. Connecting with you is something that's important to me. That's what makes it feel meaningful.
Yeah. So all these years, let's see, how many years has it been since your first book on habits?
It's been over 10 years now since The Power of Habit came out.
So I would imagine you've heard from lots and lots of folks. I think I saw some outrageous number of emails and messages you've gotten in the afterward to the second edition.
Yeah.
What are things that stand out to you about things that you've heard from folks and the kind of difference this can make in taking our habits seriously?
I've received and responded to, I think, over 33,000 emails at this point over the last decade. And the thing that's most rewarding and most meaningful is when someone writes and they say something like, I struggled with drinking for 7 or 8 years and I tried to quit and it didn't work. And then I read The Power of Habit and it gave me away and I haven't had a drink in a month. Or I've been trying to deal with anger issues and I read the book and now I know how to calm myself down when these little flare-ups occur. And the truth of the matter is, it's enormously satisfying and gratifying that they found the book and that they use the book. But the book isn't what created the change. It was them that created the change. And I think what's going on in those moments is that it's really easy to lose hope that we have control over our lives. It's really easy to lose hope that we have power, right? We feel powerless against drinking or smoking or getting angry or falling into these patterns that we don't like with our families or our friends or coworkers. And what the book did, and it's really a testament to the research of these scientists that I was able to spend time with, what the book does is it shows you are in control. You can change anything in your life. You can be someone who goes from constantly fighting with your mom to someone who's a super communicator and knows how to connect with her and knows when she starts saying things crazy, how to kind of tune her out a little bit. Everything within our lives is within our control. And oftentimes the first and most important step is just recognizing that control that we have. And sometimes that means having someone explain the gears of a habit to you so you know how to fiddle with them. Sometimes it means someone just sitting down and saying, look, when you talk to one of your friends and you're a super communicator to a friend, there's a set of skills there that once you recognize them, you can use them with anyone. It's about feeling like we have more control over our lives that is most satisfying to me. And I've been lucky to hear from a number of readers who have experienced that.
Been talking to Charles Duhigg, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, on his book, The Power of Habit, as well as his most recent bestseller, Supercommunicators. Charles, thanks so much for your time today, but even more, thanks for your work and the gift that's been to lots of folks and to me as well, personally.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's been a delight. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Charles Duhigg, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of The Power of Habit, as well as a wonderful brand new book, Supercommunicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion, and the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.